This is not breaking news. This is not a scandal. This is not about one person. This is about something quieter, more dangerous, a failure that doesn't explode. It settles in. For decades, the system you were told keeps wars from starting worked because it was boring, predictable, invisible. It relied on trust more than force, coordination more than bravado, and it only functions if everyone believes it will hold. That belief is thinning, not collapsing. Not yet, just loosening. The people whose job it is to plan for worst-case scenarios are no longer speaking in hypotheticals. They're speaking in warnings, public ones, careful ones, the kind designed to be heard without saying the unsayable out loud. If you're watching this, don't blink. This story doesn't announce itself when it turns. Stay with me. Because once you see what is actually controlling the system now, it becomes very hard to unsee. What actually controls this system now is not law, not treaties, not even weapons. It's expectation. Deterrence only works when every actor believes the other side will behave in a known, boring, almost ritualistic way. Allies coordinate, adversaries calculate, nobody improvises on live television. But that expectation is being replaced by something else. Volatility, personal signaling, rhetoric that forces institutions to translate mood into policy after the fact. That's why you're hearing uniformed leaders talk about process instead of politics, about dialogue instead of declarations, about readiness instead of threats. That language isn't neutral, it's compensatory. When generals praise partners for made with instead of made in, they're not talking about branding. They're describing a system trying to hold itself together horizontally while vertical leadership pulls away. Power is shifting from coordinated strategy to damage control, from planning to interpretation, and that's the tell. Because when the system spends more energy explaining itself than enforcing itself, something fundamental has already changed. That change didn't happen overnight, which is what made it so easy to miss. There was a time when alliances moved slowly on purpose. Delays were safeguards. Silence was stability. Before, adversaries were kept apart not by speeches, but by friction. Different incentives, different fears, different clocks. The system was designed so that coordination between rivals was expensive, awkward, inefficient. Now compare that to what's normal. Joint patrols that barely make the news, shared logistics routes, overlapping technology pipelines, military cooperation framed as research. Alignment explained away as coincidence. Nothing dramatic, nothing loud. That's the danger. Slow change doesn't trigger alarms. It trains you to adapt, to accept, to normalize what would have been unthinkable a decade ago. By the time it feels urgent, the structure has already shifted underneath you. And while attention stays locked on personalities and provocations, something quieter happens in parallel. Allies compensate. They integrate deeper. They prepare for uncertainty instead of leadership. That preparation looks like strength, but it's actually insurance. Because systems don't insure against confidence. They insure against failure. And the first real shock was never going to look like a collapse. It was always going to look like competence under strain. Then the warnings stopped being abstract. They showed up in a room, at a podium, in uniform. A senior commander stood inside an allied country and did something that almost never happens. He praised an ally not for obedience, but for independence, for building weapons together, for removing barriers, for treating security as shared production, not a transaction. That wasn't diplomacy. That was signaling. Because when a military leader publicly describes one partner as a model, he's implicitly describing a contrast. And when he does it without naming names, he's doing it so the message travels farther than the room. Listen closely to the pattern. He talks about readiness, about deterrence, about infrastructure, about the Arctic, about undersea cables, about joint commands being reorganized because the old assumptions no longer hold. None of that is ceremonial. That is what generals say when they believe the map is changing faster than the politics can keep up. When they believe reassurance must now happen laterally, ally to ally, instead of vertically. And when that starts happening in public, it means something private has already failed. Because this wasn't the crisis. It was the symptom. And the system was about to show you where the pressure was really coming from. Here's the part they don't say outright. The system still looks intact because the damage isn't where you're trained to look. It's not in budgets, not in troop numbers, not in summit photos. It's in alignment. For decades, deterrence worked by keeping adversaries strategically lonely. They shared grievances but not plans. They traded but didn't synchronize. Cooperation was shallow because trust was scarce. That friction was deliberate. What's changed is not aggression, it's efficiency. When rivals begin sharing patrol routes, technology, logistics, even narratives, the cost of acting together drops. Deterrence weakens not because anyone fires a shot, but because response time shrinks. Miscalculation becomes easier. Escalation becomes faster. And here's the quiet asymmetry. Allies absorb uncertainty. Adversaries absorb opportunity. Allies spend resources reinforcing reassurance, coordination, translation. Adversaries spend resources integrating, testing boundaries, learning each other's rhythms. One side is stabilizing, the other is optimizing. That imbalance doesn't announce itself as a crisis. It feels like management, like maintenance, like competence under pressure. But when a system spends its energy preventing collapse instead of shaping outcomes, the mechanism has already flipped. And once that flip happens, the next shock doesn't need to be big. It just needs to be timed. Then it accelerates. Not in speeches, in movements. Joint patrols where there used to be distance. Icebreakers where there used to be ice. Research vessels, mapping routes that didn't matter until the routes opened. Airspace violations, signal interference. Ships without clear ownership hovering near cables that carry everything you're using to watch this right now. This isn't chaos, it's coordination. The Arctic isn't heating up politically, it's thinning physically. And as sea lanes open, so does leverage. So commands are redrawn. Boundaries shifted. Regions bundled together under new headquarters because the old map assumed time. And time is exactly what's disappearing. Deterrence depends on delay, on warning, on space to decide. What happens when distance shrinks? When response windows compress? When three actors can move as one before the fourth finishes debating process? This is why the language suddenly gets sharper, why readiness becomes tonight, why infrastructure becomes frontline. Because the system isn't preparing for war, it's preparing for surprise. And here's the problem with surprise in a system built on trust. Once it works once, it never has to be dramatic again. It just has to be faster than expectation. This is where it reaches you, not as a headline, as friction. You feel it when prices move for reasons no one can quite explain, when supply chains harden instead of flex, when governments talk about resilience instead of prosperity, because alliance stress doesn't stay in briefing rooms. It translates into insurance costs, into energy routes, into which infrastructure gets protected first and which gets deferred. You're told this is prudence, preparation, just in case. But preparation has a price, and you're already paying it. When deterrence weakens, stability becomes expensive. When coordination frays, redundancy replaces efficiency. Systems start carrying weight they were never designed to hold. This is what strategic uncertainty looks like in civilian life. Not panic, compression, less margin, fewer buffers. If you're still here, stay here. Share this. Because what looks abstract right now hardens quickly once it touches daily life. And the reason it's touching now is because the system is quietly reorganizing around you, not to protect you, to survive without certainty. And that's the signal that something much larger is still moving. Zoom out. What started as alliance strain doesn't stay regional for long. Systems like this never do. They transmit. Energy routes reroute, shipping lanes recalculate, insurance models redraw risk maps. Neutral countries hedge, quietly. When one alliance becomes unpredictable, others don't wait for clarity. They diversify. They deepen regional pacts. They build parallel systems that don't rely on a single guarantor behaving the way it used to. You can see it in defense production going local and multinational at the same time. In intelligence sharing that gets denser among some partners and thinner with others. In countries that stop asking permission and start asking whether they'll be covered afterward. This is no longer about one region or one alliance. It's about how power behaves when confidence drains out of the center. Because global systems don't collapse symmetrically. They warp. Trade keeps moving, but differently. Security holds, but unevenly. Rules still exist, but enforcement becomes selective. That selectivity is the ripple. And once the world learns it can route around uncertainty, restoring trust becomes harder than building deterrence ever was. Which brings us to what happens next. Because from here, the system doesn't return to the old equilibrium. It chooses. From here, the system has three possible trajectories. None of them are clean. The first is by adjustment point. Allies compensate quietly. They formalize what has already been happening informally. Deeper integration, shared production, faster coordination without waiting for reassurance. Deterrence holds, but it looks different. Narrower, more regional, less forgiving of error. The second is in erosion. Nothing breaks, nothing snaps. Confidence continues to drain just enough that every actor hedges. Allies ensure, adversaries probe, red lines blur, response times shorten. Deterrence still exists, but it's brittle, dependent on perfect timing and no mistakes. And then there's rupture. Not invasion, not collapse. A moment where coordination on one side outpaces decision-making on the other. A surprise that exploits compressed distance and delayed consensus. Not catastrophic, just decisive enough to rewrite expectations. Here's the key. All three paths can begin the same way, with professionalism, with restraint. With systems working overtime to compensate for uncertainty. You don't know which path you're on until the moment passes. And by then, the choice has already been made. Not by a speech, but by the system's ability to keep up with itself. Here's the part that should make you uneasy. Nothing in this story resolves itself. Systems like this don't reset. They either adapt fast enough to hide the damage, or they keep functioning until the moment they can't. The danger isn't that leaders say the wrong thing. It's that institutions are quietly learning to operate as if they might. When generals speak in warnings instead of plans, when allies praise each other in public for filling gaps that didn't used to exist, when deterrence depends on speed instead of certainty, you are no longer in a stable era. You're in a managed one. Managed decline doesn't feel like decline. It feels like competence under pressure. Until it doesn't. So don't look for the breaking moment. That's not how this ends. Look for the moment when surprise stops being shocking and starts being expected. That's when the system has crossed the line. If you want to understand where this goes next, who adapts, who benefits, and who gets caught between coordination and delay, stay with this series, share it, watch the next one. Because the most dangerous shifts are the ones that still look like control, and this system is telling you very calmly that it's running out of margin.